Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to Scary Stories. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. Today we've got 2 Easter Dogman in Kentucky stories. But first I have a quick announcement. We are returning to 5 daily episodes per week, starting Monday, April 12th. Going to be taking a lot of time off before that though in order to prepare, so please bear with us for the next week. We hope you'll agree that it was worth the wait once the 12th arrives. Now let's jump directly into our first Easter Kentucky Dogman story of the day, which we call Dogman. On Easter Sunday. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you of my youth in the late 1960s, or maybe this was 70 or 71. I remember things still feeling like the 60s until 73 or 74, when the culture got so much more mediocre all the way around, and then you knew the 70s had really arrived. This is from when things were still alive culturally, and each day seemed to bring exciting new innovations and hope for a better tomorrow. I was working for an ad agency in a big town as a creative, making good dough while working part-time, and my 20-something ego was convinced that whatever I did was of the utmost cultural relevance. That was probably why fate threw the Dogman directly in my path, to remind me that I am not ever going to be as big a badass as the Dogman on Easter Sunday. I remember that my wife, who we can call Susie, and I were back home in Kentucky, which is where she was from. Her parents were putting us up, and we were supposed to leave the following day to return to the big city. It was Easter Sunday, and Susie insisted that we had to go to her old church that she had gone to in her childhood. We never made it to the Easter Sunday services, but we did get up close and personal with the Dogman. So we were speeding down some little country highway, driving to the services, which I did not want to go to. When Susie and I had gotten married in 1966, we were both 21, and we were both relatively straight-laced people. By this point in our progress, however, I had become something of a middle-class hippie or bohemian. I mean, I was still regarded as bourgeoisie by the hardcore artist types, but the ad agency I worked for allowed me to grow my hair long and to wear casual clothing to work as though I were a rock star. I generated enough money-making ideas for them at that time that for a short period I sort of was a rock star. My wife, however, was still Susie Homemaker by comparison. She didn't like my long hair. She would sometimes shave my beard off herself. It upset her so much. And she still made me put on a suit to go to church on Sundays, which I resented a little more each week. I didn't want to dress like that, and I didn't want to go to church. This was our one Sunday away from home, and yet she was still making me go to church. It really bothered me. Because in my family, Easter was an off day. In her family, though, everything I was saying was sacrilege and extremely personally hurtful. Neither of us was hearing what the other one was saying, because we were looking at the same thing from opposite angles. Our arguing got so severe that I had to pull the car off the road so that we could sit there and shout at each other. I remember we were off the highway on the side there, not paying any attention to where we were. I'm almost positive it was either in or near Roslyn, Kentucky, but that was not where we were driving to. It was just a spot along the way. I must have inadvertently said something especially harsh to Susie that day, and it made her burst out in tears. When Susie would cry, I would immediately crumble. It made me feel like such a villain that I would cave and let her win any argument. While I was trying to apologize, she surprised me by opening her car door and running out into the woods, Easter bonnet and all. Susie was not the type in those days to run into the woods even if she was wearing tennis shoes, so I knew I was really in trouble this time. She might want a separation or worse, I thought, but even more frightening to me back then was that she might get hurt in those woods, and then it would be all my fault. So I ran into the forest after her, thinking I was running where she had. I didn't see any shoe prints in the ground, though, and I didn't see my wife anywhere. I just kept charging through the woods, calling her name as loudly as I could, not having any idea where I was heading or if I was getting any closer to Susie. I was filled with guilt and regret and panic that I might have a whole lot more to be guilty and regretful for soon if I didn't find my wife. I remember breaking through a patch of bushes, and there she was. She was running along the Cat Creek in the woods. I'm telling you, people were more dramatic back in the 60s, or the 70s, or whenever this was. I remained at my distance from her, and monitored her progress as I jogged along. I could see her. Then foliage would come between us. Then I would catch sight of her again. I didn't want to approach her while she was still running. I thought I would only frighten her deeper into the woods. When she slowed down to a stroll, observing the creek and taking on a more relaxed posture, I began to drum up the internal courage I would need to go over to my wife and give her the apology that she would need to start to forgive me. Man, I was shaking all over with one kind of fear, when suddenly I saw something watching my wife that filled me with an entirely different kind of fear. At first impression, this was a man with deformed legs, about my size, facing away from me and toward my wife. He was between the two of us, and I don't think he had noticed me yet. I've been asked if I was upwind or downwind of him, but I'm sorry, I'm not Captain Nature, and I don't even really know what those two terms mean. He was aware of my wife, but he didn't seem to be aware of me. I could see the backbone of the man, and I thought he must be a thin fellow and shirtless. On the other hand, I saw what I thought was some kind of fringe hanging from his forearm, so I wondered if he might be wearing a torn shirt. I thought I was about the same size as him, yet I was afraid of the idea of potentially having to have a violent confrontation with him. He seemed much wilder than I was, and I didn't really think I could take him in a fight. But if I didn't do something, this nut job was going to do something to Susie. So she walked along the creek, lost in thought, while this bony stranger watched her, and I watched him. We were both waiting for our time to act, and my wife was oblivious to all of this. The idea that made the most sense to me in the moment was to try to get ahead of both of them, then cut across to the creek to get Susie the heck out of there. If I played it right, I wouldn't even have to tell her about the weird guy at all. Now, that plan might have worked if I had been correct in my initial assessment of who and what that guy was. By the time I had gotten in front of him and looked back, though, my eyes witnessed something entirely different than what my brain had been expecting to see. This was not a short, thin guy with rags dangling from his forearms. This was a much larger guy than I had presumed, but he was bent forward to make himself look smaller and not give himself away as he stalked Susie. The bony back I saw was only the bottom half of his back, which I could now see widened into a massive, hairy chest, the like of which I've never seen outside of a bodybuilding meet. The rags I thought were dangling from his forearms were actually long, matted fur, as this was not a man at all, but some very strange and unique kind of animal. Yes, it walked on two legs, but it was still an animal, even if it could somehow perform this trick. The legs it was walking on were not deformed or broken, which is what I was initially thinking. No, they were just animal legs, that's all. It hunched over its front paws so that I couldn't see them, but I got a very clear view of the immense animal's face. It was extremely canine in appearance, to say the least. I was witnessing an upright walking canine stalking my wife, and although I didn't really know what to make of that, I feared the worst. The creature couldn't possibly have good intentions. I needed to make my move and get out of the woods to warn Susie, yet try not to alarm her if I could prevent it. I did just that, or at least I took my first few steps toward doing that, when the Dogman simultaneously decided it was time to make his move. Racing a few steps out, I tried to beat the Dogman to the creek, crashing loudly through the underbrush and willingly giving my location away. The creature and I emerged into Susie's viewpoint at the same moment. She looked up to see me and she scowled. The Dogman looked over to see me, and you know what? He scowled too. I shouted to Susie to look, and I pointed at the beast, which had now turned its attention fully onto me. Susie wouldn't look. She was still angry at me from earlier and being spiteful. The Dogman had no problem looking at me, though. I saw his pupils enlarge, then focus and contract. It was like nature's version of a red laser pointer light on my forehead, and goosebumps raised on my arms. My body shook all over in uncontrollable fear. I saw his hideous face turn into a horrifying grimace and his lips curl back to display his massive doggy dentures. I had gotten him to leave my wife alone. The trouble was, now he had his sights on me. I shouted her name again and pointed once more, but this time when I looked at the Dogman, it had already started trotting in my direction. I had no more time to warn that woman. I had to run for my life in that moment. I remember that she did see the Dogman. I knew it because I could hear her screams of horror, even over his growling and barking at me as I ran. I prayed internally that she was running back to the car. I was probably a goner, but if my last actions at least saved Susie's life, then I suppose that would have been the reason I was put on Earth in the first place. Some people spend their lives yearning for meaning, but in that moment, I honestly felt prepared to go if need be. I would be leaving the play after having saved the life of the woman I loved. At least that could be said about me once I was gone. Nevertheless, I really didn't want to die, so I ran like a maniac along the creek bed and then out into a field as soon as I could manage. There were some people there. I don't know who they were. About 4 or 5 middle-aged people over to my left, and I called to them for help. I remember being surprised as they bravely ran toward me, shouting and waving their arms at someone or something behind me. After tripping over my own tired, panicking feet and tumbling onto the grass, I turned and watched these total strangers running toward that Dogman, as though they had no fear of him at all. It was like they were chasing off a random boar that had wandered onto their property. And the Dogman, well, I won't say he looked scared of those people, but he sure did look disgusted and annoyed. I had a feeling they had all met before, but I didn't stick around to interview them about it. I knew that the Dogman might be heading back toward my car, and I prayed that was where Susie had headed. Like a man with tunnel vision, I ran furiously along the grass until I found a path into the woods back to my car, and I took it. Behind me, those people were all shouting things at me, but I couldn't stop to listen to what they were saying. I had to get to my car before the Dogman did. I remember running through those woods, all of my senses on high alert. I was very nearly having an out-of-body experience. I was so clear in my thought, while my body ran almost on its own. I remember praying that my wife could hear my thoughts, that we could have a psychic link at least for a moment, so that she would hear me and get back into the car. That would be the safest place for her to be, and I psychically willed her to hear me telling her that. When I reached the car on the side of the road, and I saw Susie standing next to it, I felt such a sense of elation I had never felt before. She must have heard my thoughts. She must know what I'm thinking and feeling. She is my true soulmate. And then, as I raced toward her, Susie looked at me in horror, and she backed away from me in fear. She hadn't heard my thoughts. She couldn't read my thinking. She was afraid of me as I was trying to save her. I realized in that moment that Susie and I were not, and never will be, soulmates. Susie is just my wife, and she's a wife who is thoroughly confused by her very weird husband. I shouted at her to get in the car, and she told me that she refused to do anything I said. In the next instant, that Dogman ran out of the woods on all fours. Then it stood up and howled, a kind of a sound that makes your adrenal glands release the kraken, if you know what I mean. The Dogman, standing at its full height, walked slowly toward the car as I dove into the driver's seat and looked around outside for where my wife had gone to. She was inexplicably in the passenger seat next to me, urging me to start the engine already. She refused to do what I said, but she jumped too when the Dogman said something. So I'd like to tell you that this incident caused me and my wife to mature a little bit and to learn to cut each other some slack from then on. In truth, it just pretty much defines our relationship straight up till today. I tell her she'll miss me after I'm gone, but she says she's gonna let me outlast her just so I feel guilty about it. It's almost like we stay alive to bother the other one, but I suppose there are worse ways to go through life. And so, we didn't grow or change at all, and we didn't learn a single life lesson from our encounter with the Dogman on Easter Sunday. One more Dogman story to go. Right after we thank today's executive producer for Easter, it's Dave Rabbit. Dave Rabbit got the habit of being a channel member. Dave Rabbit, dag nabbit, he's who we remember today. Happy Easter, everyone, and thanks, Dave Rabbit, for making this episode possible. Dave gets to see our weekly Sunday secret uncensored stories, and so can you. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else do what Dave Rabbit did and click the join link below this or any of our videos to become a channel member. And now, let's wander just a wee bit south of Roslyn, Kentucky, where their last story took place, and visit lovely Cat Creek, Kentucky, in the tale that we call the Cat Creek Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a Kentucky Dogman story for you that stretches back almost 20 years now. It happened in the town of Cat Creek, Kentucky, nearby the creek itself. It was the scariest thing that ever happened to Marybelle and me, and I thank the Lord every night in my prayers that He allowed me to live to tell the tale of that encounter. It very easily could have been the last anyone ever heard of me. For those of you unfamiliar with this part of Kentucky, we've got a creek called the Cat Creek that runs through a few towns, and our town is named after the creek. We are Cat Creek, Kentucky, or we were when I lived there. In those days, we went to the Cat Creek Church, which is located on the Cat Creek Road, across the field from where the Cat Creek itself ran past us. I remember this all took place on Easter Sunday, although I'm not 100% certain of the year. It was after we had attended services, my then girlfriend, who is now my wife, and I. We left our respective families at the church and walked off across the field behind the church to enjoy the bounty God provides us with each spring. Once we reached the other forested side where the Cat Creek flows, we leaned against a tree nearby the water. Marybelle, not her real name, was wearing a pastel-colored dress and coat with matching shoes, and it was still a little bit muddy under the tree cover, so we weren't going to wander too far into those woods. Just far enough to be out in nature and enjoy each other's company for a while. Back then, before we were married, we had to really struggle to make any time to be alone with each other. After the last year and a half, now we have to struggle to find any alone time, but that's a different story. On that day, we were having fun doing our thing, when suddenly, Marybelle started shivering all over. I asked her what was wrong, and she asked me if I didn't feel the change in the atmosphere. I didn't, but I could tell she wasn't faking it or joking around. She shushed me and pointed toward the water, where we could both see this plainly supernatural and demonic type entity walking along in broad daylight. It was entirely covered in hair or fur, as I always had thought the devil would look like if he appeared up here on earth. He wore no clothes, just as though he were a beast, but he walked on his hind legs in mockery of man and the angels, so that you know he possessed cunning, if not true intelligence. The head of the creature was canine, like some people say the Catholic St. Christopher is said to have looked. There was nothing saintly about this beast, however, and nothing noble or sacred about it either. We ran back to my parents' house and brought people back with us to search the creek, but there was no sign of the demonic Dogman by the time we got back there. The creature must have stood 6 feet tall, even though it was hunched over as it walked. People asked me if it might have been a prehistoric caveman, and I asked them if cavemen had dog heads. I don't really know what it was, but it wasn't a caveman, because we saw it after church, and because it was so horrible to look at. I just feel in my gut that this was a supernatural thing, and that it either was sent by the devil or wandered out of his domain. I'm neither a scientist nor a pastor, so I'm willing to admit I'm wrong if someone can prove otherwise what it was that we saw that afternoon walking over by the creek. When I tell the story to my family these days, my grandson calls it the Cat Creek Dogman.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. If you have a scary experience you want to tell us about, you can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.